Joe Evinger. My name is Joe Evinger, and I coordinate this group's events with the help of our co-host and tech expert, Hillary Naylor. All of our members have educational backgrounds and experience in various fields, but we all share a common interest in science and new ideas. We currently have over 60 members here at Ashby Village in our group and another 100 on our guest list. We meet via Zoom on the second Thursday of every month from 3 o'clock until around 4:30. We have a different guest each month who speaks to us on a topic related to science and ideas. We rely on our Science and Ideas group members, all Ashby Village members, our invitees, presenters, and others for ideas about new speakers and ways to connect with them. Besides our presentation today, we are actively recruiting speakers who might present to us in the coming months. Here are a few of the upcoming topics. In May, Daniel Westcott, PhD in plant biology, will make a presentation on the fundamental science of food and photosynthesis. You know, everybody's talking about the weather, so we have two upcoming presentations on this topic. In June, Dr. Ben Santer, an atmospheric scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, will give a presentation on the topic concerning our global client system. We'll also go later on in the summer, and Joel Pomeretz, as a speaker and natural history education writer, will make a presentation to us on atmospheric rivers and California climate history. In August, Martha Jones, a PhD in economics and associate professor in the Department of Medicine and Health at Vanderbilt, will speak to us on economic demography and global health. And in October, we're going to totally change subjects and talk about the conservations of vultures in the world. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group. We are interested in, if you are interested in other presentations, please visit our website. And consider, we are a 501c3. Consider making a donation to us. Go to our website, and Hillary, would you please post the website link and read about what we do. Now on to our speaker today. We have Dr. Seth Finnegan with us, and he's going to speak on the topic climate crises and mass extinctions in the ocean, both past and future. He will review the evolving understanding and causes and consequences of marine mass extinctions and highlight some surprisingly potential troubling similarities between these ancient events and the present moment. Seth was raised in Illinois by parents who are members of Ashby Village, Greg and Robin Finnegan, and thank you, Greg and Robin, for sharing your son with us today. They encouraged him to explore the outdoors. Seth was never told that growing up to become a paleontologist was not a realistic goal. After college at University of Chicago, he moved west to begin graduate school at UC Riverside and has been captivated by California ever since. Following postdoctoral positions at Stanford and Caltech, Seth joined the Department of Integrative Biology and the UC Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley in 2012. He and his students work on a wide range of problems in the marine fossil record, with ongoing projects in coastal California, Quebec, Europe, Central America, and elsewhere. And now finally, I present to you Dr. Seth Finnegan. Welcome, Seth.
Well, thank you very much. It's wonderful to virtually meet many of you, and also to see, obviously, my parents, but also some other familiar and very dear faces in their little tiny boxes. So let me go ahead and see if I can share screen to get going here. And all right, everyone see that okay?
Good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming. And I do, just one moment. I want to begin just by thanking the people who, in a very literal sense, are the reason that I'm here. but also more broadly, many of you know my parents, Robin and Greg Finnegan, and I've been very happy to have them. So I've been at Berkeley since 2012 now, and for the past 5 years, they've been living in Oakland. It's been wonderful for me, and I thank all of you for really making that transition much easier than it might otherwise be, despite the very challenging several years that we've all had. So I'm going to begin just with a little bit of a defense. So why is it that I study the marine fossil record, and in particular, the marine invertebrate fossil record? So many of you probably, although this is a pretty well-educated audience, maybe a little bit less so, but often still probably, if you think of paleontology, you think of fossils, you probably think of something like this T-Rex here on the left. This is in the atrium of the Valley Life Sciences building that I'm sitting in right now on the UC Berkeley campus, outside the UC Museum of Paleontology, and it is obviously a spectacular fossil. Why would I spend my time on the things on the right, these clams and snails? So, whoops. So, well, there's actually a lot of reasons why the marine fossil record is a particularly compelling subject for study. Life, so far as we understand it, first evolved in the ocean. So the great majority of the history of life took place in the oceans. And in fact, at high levels of biodiversity, so many species live on land, and the terrestrial ecosystems are arguably maybe even more diverse at the species level. But the majority of phyla, sort of high-level, deep divergences among animals, most of those groups still are confined to the oceans. And another important thing that distinguishes the marine fossil record is sort of, to a first approximation, what happens on Earth is that continents get uplifted and they erode and they make sediments, and those sediments get transported in rivers and deposited in the oceans. And if I want to one day be a fossil, which I do, I have a much better chance of ending up that way if I die on the continental margins in the ocean in a site of sedimentation than if I die somewhere on an eroding continent. So the fossil record of marine ecosystems is much more complete because the sedimentary record is much more complete. And then finally, for the kinds of questions that I'm most interested in, what we want to do is try and unravel the history of marine biodiversity and understand how Earth's changing environment has influenced biodiversity. And it turns out that the chemical composition of the shells and bones of marine organisms that precipitate those shells from the ocean is actually a tremendously informative source of information about the environmental and the climate history of the planet. And there are just simply many, many more fossils of marine invertebrates on Earth than there are. The T-Rex is wonderful, but if I wanted to find one, I'm going to have to drive 1,000 miles. If I'm lucky enough to find one, it's going to take me several years to excavate it, whereas I can go out and within less than an hour's drive of here, I can go out towards the Briones Park and find these fossils on the left, or I can go down to the Santa Cruz area, as I am going in a couple of days to take a class, and collect potentially thousands of fossils of marine invertebrates. And even vertebrates will tend to be better preserved in these kinds of environments. So this right here, this is very small, but believe it or not, this is an articulated whale fossil from near Santa Cruz. That's about 5 million years old. So paleontologists have been studying the marine fossil record for more than 150, 200 years now, and have built up from many, many millions of collections a pretty good understanding of the history of marine biodiversity that allows us to produce curves like this on the bottom, So what we're looking at here on the y-axis is genus diversity, So a genus is just a group of related species. So these are sort of the numbers of genera that are known in the fossil record that belong to different groups here on the right. And don't worry too much about the names. Some of those will be familiar, some of them less so. And we can see how those groups have waxed and waned in diversity through time. And from really the earliest days of doing these sorts of compilations, and the first one was published in 1860, just a year after Darwin published The Origin of the Species, and Darwin was already well aware of them. It's been clear that there are big drops in diversity in the marine record at certain times. And as our understanding of this record has come more and more into focus, it's become clearer and clearer that those drops are large and comparatively rapid. Darwin was aware of them, but Darwin really, as he thought about many other problems, believed that the incompleteness of the geological record made them appear sudden, but in fact they weren't, right? That they were artifacts of an incomplete record. And that was the dominant paradigm for more than 100 years. And it's really only in the second half of the 20th century that that perception started to change, partly through the compilation of databases like this, and partly actually through the work of scientists right here at Berkeley that many of you are probably familiar with, in particular, implicating a very large bolide impact as the cause of the most recent major mass extinction at the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. So on the top panel here is our current understanding of variation in extinction rates through time. And you can see there's a lot of quite interesting structure here, but there are sort of 5 major events that stand out above the background. And these are what we normally refer to as the big 5 major mass extinction events. So again, the Cretaceous Paleogene event that we think was caused by that big bolide hitting the Yucatan is down here. And I'm not going to have time to go through all of these. They're all sort of interesting commonalities, but also very distinct differences across all of them. Instead, I'm just going to highlight a couple of them that are clearly linked in particular to climate change. And other thing I'm gonna build one additional, the reason we know that these things are linked to climate change is, as I mentioned, because in addition to sort of compiling a record of biodiversity through time, the other thing we're able to do from looking at marine fossils is by analyzing their chemistry to actually back out most of our understanding of the history of climate on Earth actually comes from very humble organisms like these brachiopods. So this is a group that I spent a lot of time studying. They were quite diverse and ecologically important several hundred million years ago. They are still around today, but sort of a sad shadow of their former self, but you can still find them if you care enough. But if I take one of these things and I throw it under a scanning electron microscope, I can see that this shell is made up of these beautiful calcite prisms. And calcium is calcite is a calcium carbonate mineral. And there are 3 elements in there: calcium, carbon, and oxygen. And it turns out actually all 3 of those are informative. I'm not going to talk much about calcium. It's a bit more complicated. But it turns out that looking in particular at stable isotope ratios in carbon and in oxygen provides a tremendous amount of information about the history of Earth's carbon cycle and about the history of climate, right? And those 2 things obviously are very tightly tied to one another. So I'm not going to go into details right now about how we actually extract that information, although I'm very happy to afterwards if people want to ask more detailed questions. But basically, the ratio of the rarer heavy isotope of carbon, carbon-13, to the more abundant light isotope, carbon-12. And I'm talking here about the stable isotopes. Most of you will be aware that carbon also has a heavier unstable isotope, carbon-14. And that, of course, is also tremendously important scientifically because we're able to use it for dating relatively recent events. So here I'm just talking about the stable isotopes, the ones that persist sort of indefinitely. That can give us a lot of information about the carbon cycle, particularly because there is a strong isotopic fractionation whenever carbon is passed through carboxylation enzymes in the process of photosynthesis. So it can tell us a lot about how much photosynthesis is happening and how much photosynthetically fixed carbon is getting buried through time. And then if we look at the oxygen that's contained in these shells, the ratio of the rare heavier isotope O18 to the more abundant light isotope O16 actually provides information about climate, both directly, we can actually use this under the right conditions as a paleothermometer, and also indirectly because it turns out to be strongly influenced by the amount of ice that is locked up on the Earth's poles in the form of polar ice sheets through time. So these sorts of humble fossils, and at the bottom here, this is a foraminiferan. This is a group not even actually an animal. These are sort of relatives of amoebae, so even humbler than a brachiopod, but these are the real workhorses of our understanding of Earth's climate and environmental history. So for example, many of you probably know that over the past 60+ million years, Earth's climate has experienced some interesting ups and downs, but has generally cooled, and that until quite recently, we were in a very cold global state, a glacial state. We're now in an interglacial, and if we weren't here, we would probably be due to head back into another glacial. But of course, we are busily leveraging our way out of that, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. But our understanding of climate history, of this long-term cooling through time, is built up from these tiny microfossils drilled out of the ocean floor all over the planet. So every one of these little gray dots represents a single foraminiferan that has been isotopically analyzed. So that allows us to add another layer of information onto this plot, right? So that we can see not just the waxing and waning of biodiversity in different groups through time and where there are major mass extinction events, but also some sense, for example, of global mean temperature through time. And when you do this, right, you'll immediately see that, first of all, there's no simple systematic relationship, right? It isn't simply that biodiversity goes up when it's warm and down when it's cold, or vice versa, but that some of these major mass extinction events coincide with particular global climate extremes. And I'll start by talking about the event that a lot of my own fieldwork happens to focus most on, which is the Late Ordovician mass extinction here. This is also sort of the first, the oldest of the canonical Big Five major mass extinctions. And I'll use that as an example to sort of talk through how we go about trying to extract this information and answer questions about the causes of extinction events. And then I'll pivot to talking about the biggest mass extinction in the history of at least animal life on Earth, the Permian-Triassic extinction right here, a little bit later on. Okay, so start by getting situated in the late Ordovician world, right? So this is will be familiar to any of you who have spent a lot of time around museums. This is, of course, a museum diorama. So this is a period of time just before life was really beginning to get established on land. We have just a little bit of evidence that the earliest ancestral land plants were beginning to sort of push their way into freshwater environments, maybe with some small arthropod communities associated with them, but there's relatively little happening on land. This is still pretty much a world of marine biodiversity. And we're now, several tens of millions of years after the Cambrian explosion, during which a lot of the major phyla make their first appearances in the fossil record, although clearly their evolutionary history is much longer. So there are some familiar and less familiar groups of organisms populating the oceans, right? There are like these large nautiloid cephalopods, right? So these are very distant relatives of modern nautilus and of the ammonites, which some of you may be familiar with, victims of a more recent major mass extinction. There are corals like these tabulate corals and rugose corals here, although they are not the corals that dominate the oceans today. They're very different groups. And then there's a sort of rich variety of other weird wonders, and a quite good fossil record of this time period. There's lots of heavily calcifying organisms. So some of the sort of lucky groups that participate in this major mass extinction event, again, that some of you will be more familiar with, the trilobites, probably the sort of closest that we have to charismatic megafauna of the Ordovician world. Brachiopods, which I have already mentioned, the rugose and tabulate corals. There are quite a few mollusks already populating the world at this point, clams and snails, in addition to the cephalopods I already mentioned. Crinoids, another group that still exists today, but is a shadow of its former self. And it's also a pretty different world in terms of, again, I mentioned the lack of life on land, right? You'll notice that the continents are all rendered here as basically desert. And the arrangement of continents is very, very different from what we're used to. So most of you, I'm sure, are aware that at a point in the past, all of the major continental land masses were united in a single landmass called Pangaea. This is actually a couple of 100 million years before the formation of Pangaea. So for example, this right here, this is North America, sitting astride the tropics and rotated about 90 degrees clockwise, and missing a number of parts that have subsequently become part of North America, including most of California. And I'm going to, for the rest of this part of the talk, I'm going to focus on one particular part of North America that has a particularly good record through this time interval. So first thing we do if we're interested in one of these events is go and say, all right, where can we go where there's a really good fossil record that is extensive and well exposed and well preserved, that we can really dig in and try and come up with a chronology of events and understand what really happened. So for, I don't know, about 10, 15 years or so now, I've on and off been going to do fieldwork in a place called Anacostia Island that again, in the late Ordovician world, sat in the tropics, maybe 15 to 20 degrees south latitude. At present is up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Quebec, just to the west of Newfoundland. And for reasons that I won't go into here, it happens to have an extremely good, extensive record through a period of time where many other records have gaps that are actually related to major climate changes and changes in sea level. So this is what it looks like. It has been relatively recently glaciated, just in the last 12,000, 20,000 years. And one consequence of that is that the ice sheets have only recently receded here. And so the land surface is really popping up and rebounding, and you get these beautiful exposures of coastal cliffs. It's a little hard to see the scale here, but like there's a little harbor seal right down here to get oriented. So you have really good coastal exposures of these thick limestone sequences recording about 20 million years before, during, and after the late Ordovician mass extinction event. And these rocks are incredibly fossiliferous. So if I just sort of walk up to the cliff and pick up a rock and look at it, it often looks like this, right? So these are limestones that are composed largely of fossils. Right, so on here I have pieces of trilobites, brachiopods, another group I haven't talked about before, bryozoa. There are corals on here, and this is true of almost any sample I'm going to pick up. Right, so it's chock full of fossils. And then fortunately, you also have a lot of river incision. So there's a lot of outcrop to look at both along the coasts and in the interior. It's a very beautiful place. There are lots of waterfalls. It, for most of the time I've been working there, was pretty dependably empty. There's about 250 people who live there. It's a large island, but very few people live there. although during the pandemic, it became much more popular as a tourism destination, largely for people from Quebec. And again, just a few more examples of sort of what the fossil record looks like here. So just looking at different bedding planes, here are these beautiful coral colonies that are sort of growing in situ right on top of one another, right? So this really kind of looks like what you would expect if you could go snorkeling on the Ordovician seafloor. And there are other surfaces here covered in fossils. And then there are just some very weird things. They're like, for example, this surface here covered in what sort of looks like tree trunks. And you can see my hammer here for scale, only I just told you there aren't any trees yet. There's barely any terrestrial plants. These are actually, believe it or not, sponges, very weird kind of calcifying sponge that grew up in sort of sponge forests, some of them 3, 4, 5 meters off of the seafloor. So this is just a lot of very weird stuff that is fun to explore. But the way we go about this kind of fieldwork is simply to spend a lot of time wandering around in canyons and along the coast and collecting samples and building up an understanding of the comings and goings of different species. So, for example, this is a figure put together from one of my graduate students' ongoing dissertation work. And the way to read this figure is on the left here, we have a representation of the geologic record, the stratigraphic column, so older sediments on the bottom becoming younger as you go up. During the period of time during which this mass extinction is occurring, and then every one of these on the x-axis is a different species. And the points here are stratigraphic levels at which we have collected that particular species. So based on that, right, we can get a sense of when species are appearing and when they are disappearing. And one of the things you can notice here, right, is that we have a lot of species disappearing from the record at this level indicated right here, right? So we can already start to identify some targets, some periods of time, parts of the stratigraphic record that maybe are particularly interesting to us. Those are parts of the record that we were already quite interested in, because if you go out and actually interpret the sedimentary record as a record of water depth, which is not entirely straightforward, but a fairly standard thing to do, we know that that same level is also interesting in that it represents by far the shallowest water depositional environments in the entire 20 million year record of period of time that is captured on Anacostia Island. And so we see this rapid change from relatively deep water depositional environments. These are, relatively deep by the standards of what we're looking at. So maybe 50 to 100 meters, shallowing up to water that is perhaps just a few tens of meters deep, and culminating in the formation of a beautiful series of reefs. This is one of my colleagues here standing next to one of them. And if you zoom in on these, you can see that these are full of corals. And these, again, are sort of the shallowest water environments that we see anywhere through this sequence. And then immediately on top of those, we see rapid deepening again, a return to deep water environments, right? So we know something interesting is happening with sea level. So the next thing we do is we're collecting fossils both in order to understand their stratigraphic ranges and their relative abundances and the kinds of habitats in which they are occurring and not occurring, but also we're analyzing them for their chemistry to try and understand changes in the environment and changes in the climate through time. So this here, again, this is a rugose coral, and a now extinct group of corals that are quite dominant through this sequence. We take these things, we slice them up, we do a lot of elemental mapping to try and understand how they have been altered, because these are fossils that are 450 million years old, and even in a very well-preserved sequence like this, a lot of things happen to a coral in 450 million years, so we have to be very careful to try and screen them and pick the ones that we think are preserving closest to a primary record of the chemistry of the oceans in which they grew. And based on that, we make curves like this, looking at, say, the ratio of carbon isotopes in these sediments through time, oxygen isotopes, a couple of other, a little bit further in the weeds measurements that I won't go into detail right now. But these tell us that at this same level, where we see a pulse of extinction and rapid shallowing, we also have evidence for a very large perturbation of the global carbon cycle. And quite a bit of cooling, perhaps on the order of 5 to maybe 6 or 7 degrees Celsius, which is a lot. Again, remember, this is a tropical, paleotropical environment. So we can establish that that sea level drop coincides with this big carbon excursion, and carbon excursion tells us that we are burying a lot of carbon pretty quickly. And again, maybe not surprising if we think about the present day, when we were concerned about warming associated with putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. We take a lot of carbon out of the ocean atmosphere system, our expectation is going to be sharp cooling, and that is what we see. And this also coincides with evidence from other parts of the world that were closer to the South Pole of the growth of glaciers. So in places that today are very unexpected, North Africa in particular, we have extensive evidence of rapid growth of glaciers at this time. So we can establish a temporal coincidence, but these events are pretty complicated, right? So if we think about everything that's happening in the world right now, whenever we start perturbing the carbon cycle, perturbing the climate, right, there are many things that change at once. And so establishing causality is much more difficult, right? So paleontology is a historical science. We can't go out and do repeated experiments. And so this really falls into the realm of numerical modeling and statistical analysis. So in particular, what we are often looking for is what we call a selective signature to that extinction event that implicates some potential causes of the many that are out there. And sort of by analogy, we actually use a lot of statistics that we import from epidemiology, because they have in many cases sort of a similar data structure. They have similar problems with missing and incomplete data. And they are often asking sort of similar sorts of historical questions. So what you're looking for is, what's the aberration from the normal pattern? So the analogy here is with, rather than extinction of lineages, with mortality of individuals, comparing in this case the 1918 flu, right, which was of course absolutely devastating, compared to 1892, which is a sort of quote unquote normal flu pandemic. And so you can see, if we look at, for example, the age structure of mortality associated with those two pandemics, we can see that there are some commonalities. And we see this also in the fossil record. We see that there are certain traits that are sort of reliably associated with extinction risk, regardless of the cause. But the other thing we note here in the case of the 1918 pandemic is the real signature of this event, the departure from norm that implicates a particular mechanism, is this big mode of mortality among otherwise healthy young adults. So we take the same sort of approach to looking at patterns of extinction during the events. And in the case of the late Ordovician mass extinction, again, focusing on the fossil record of my favorite group here, brachiopods. So this is a synthesis from a global database where we looked at extinctions before, during, and after this event, and a bunch of different possible correlates. Two things jump out as sort of unique to this event, which is the preferential extinction of genera that had relatively limited paleolatitudinal ranges, which we expect to be a correlate of sort of their thermal tolerance range, their ability to adapt to rapid climate changes, and also of species that were limited to relatively deeper waters. And that's important because that's something we expect to see when changes in oxygenation are a major driver of extinction. And that's a picture that is still just coming into focus for this event. We have a lot of sort of somewhat seemingly on the face of it contradictory evidence that we're sifting through to try and better understand what's going on with oxygenation of the oceans at this time. It's a very different world, as I mentioned before, and one way in which it's different is that we think that the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere was enough to support animals, but it's significantly lower than present day. And that probably means that even relatively modest changes in the climate would have led to potentially very large changes in the amount of dissolved oxygen in the oceans. I'm going to revisit this issue of temperature and oxygen in just a moment when we move on to talk about an event that is an extreme in the opposite direction. So I think before I move on to that, I just want to take a moment. I know that was a lot. Does anyone have any questions they want to throw out at this stage?
I would ask a general question about these 5 events you spoke of. One of them you mentioned already was some kind of a meteorite. How about the other 4? Do you have any theories? Volcanoes, sunspots?
Yeah, no, great question. I would say the oldest 2, including the late Ordovician mass extinction and the late Devonian mass extinction, are maybe unsurprisingly the least well understood. In the case of late Ordovician, I just told you that it's related to glaciation, but we really don't understand what triggered that glaciation. We don't really understand if that's the only thing going on. The late Devonian is a very interesting and weird kind of protracted event. The third major one, the late Permian mass extinction, and the next major mass extinction, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, are both pretty clearly unambiguously related to extremely large volcanic eruptions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the case of the late Permian. The Cretaceous Paleogene is actually, some of you may know, remains actually a little bit controversial. I would say that, there is probably a 90% consensus in the field that the major driver of that event is a bolide impact. But it's a little bit interesting that it also coincides with one of these very, very major volcanic eruptions, in that case, something called the Deccan Traps eruption, which occurs in northern India. So I would say, we have still a bit of controversy, but pretty firm ideas about the major causes of the more recent 3. The older 2 are, we still see them, very much through a glass darkly.
But to follow up, when it's a steep drop, like the Permian, that suggests some kind of catastrophic event that happened very, very quickly, if not instantly, as in a meteorite impact. Whereas the ones that are more sloped, that maybe suggests a slower event, maybe the sun going cooler for some unknown reason. Or what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's certainly, the rate is really important. The figure here is a little bit misleading, only in the sense that we're able to, at the global scale, we can divide up time geologically and correlate globally with, on average, something like 3 to 5 million year resolution. So these are still pretty coarse time bins. And so when you see a big drop from one to the other, all it really says is there was a big drop, between one 3 or 4 million year time band in another. What you can say is that some of them, like the late Devonian event here, are clearly more protracted, where at least there are multiple pulses, and the rates but the rate of change is often something that we are able to get at locally, but globally is still very, very challenging. So for the late Ordovician event, or sorry, for the Cretaceous Paleogene event, we have lots of reason to think that that was, essentially a single bad day 66 million years ago. I'll present a little bit of evidence. We're able, partly through work done here at Berkeley, to constrain the Permian-Triassic event to having occurred, at least the main pulse of it, within about 60,000 years, which is long in the human time span, but quite short geologically, and it's possible that it is considerably faster than that.
Seth, Roger has a question.
Yeah.
Right. So I just wanted to ask about why some types of animals are able to get through these extinction events better than others. And I was thinking particularly of the cephalopods, because I know that nautilus that still exists today look a lot like some of the stuff you were showing in your slides.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and a lot of my research is sort of focused on trying to answer exactly that question. This question of sort of selectivity: why are some species hit harder than others? And it's a little bit different for every event. And one of the things that I'll note about nautiloids is they're around today, but they're kind of a last vestige. They were formerly quite a lot more diverse, along with their cousins, the ammonites, which become entirely extinct at the same time as the non-avian dinosaurs at the end. So there's just one lineage that remains from a group that was fairly diverse throughout most of the previous 400 million years. But it's interesting to ask why they survive when the ammonites become extinct, and there are some ideas about their geographic distributions and how that may have helped them to survive when ammonites did not. It's also always, you always have to consider the possibility that there's an element of luck in some of this, right? That it's a coin toss, and sometimes it's just a few lineages that manage to get through. And once they do, sometimes they just hang on. It's kind of a sad remnant, like the nautiloids. Sometimes they will very quickly rediversify from those few lineages that make it through and may equal or exceed their previous diversity. But it's a great question, and I will address it a little bit in the next part of the talk, talking about the Permian-Triassic event.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, again, in a single talk, unfortunately, I'd love to spend time on all of these events. They're all fascinating, but I'm going to shift and choose sort of one other exemplar from the other end of the spectrum. And also, we can't ignore it because measured in terms of both rate and magnitude of extinction, it's probably the largest. Certainly the largest in terms of rate, except for the Cretaceous Paleogene event. And again, let's sort of, get acquainted with some of the lucky participants in this event. So a number of the groups that become entirely, so this is an event that involves, it's a little bit hard to estimate at the species level, but somewhere probably from 80 to 90% of all the species that existed in the oceans in the late Permian world disappear, within less than 1 million years in association with this event. So every major group that's out there experiences significant species losses. Some of them squeak through, some of them don't. So the major groups that become entirely extinct are, for example, on land, the pelycosaurs, these things, which are commonly, you've probably, this is Dimetrodon, you're probably familiar with these. They're often thought of as dinosaurs, but they're not actually dinosaurs. They're more closely related to us, actually. They're sort of distant cousins on the mammalian lineage that existed before dinosaurs evolved. But they were sort of some of the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates at the time. They become extinct. One of my own personal favorites, the trilobites. And the trilobites by this point are already a little bit of a sad remnant, having lost quite a lot of diversity in the previous two major mass extinctions, but this event wipes the slate clean for trilobites. Both of those major groups of corals that dominated the Paleozoic world that I talked about before, the rugose and the tabulate corals, become entirely extinct. And it's only after this event that the scleractinian corals, the corals that we think of, the modern reef-building corals, come onto the scene. And then a lot of other sort of, subgroups that are, it's not important to know all their names, but lots and lots of major groups become entirely extinct at this time. And again, there are a few that just squeak through, like the ammonoids experience 97% extinction, but manage to get through and rediversify and then dominate global oceans for another 150 million years before finally buying it in the next major mass extinction. And as before, if we want to really understand what's going on in the world at this time, we want to seek out a part of the world that has an exceptionally good fossil record. And there's a number of places in the late Permian world where we can do that, but one that has been particularly informative and particularly important in our evolving understanding of this event is over here. So this is now sort of the heyday of Pangea, right? So you can see all the continents by this point have aggregated. They have greened. There are forests and extensive terrestrial ecosystems. But it's still kind of a bewildering place to try and get situated. So believe it or not, this block over here is actually modern day South China. And some of you may know, if you've traveled in China, that the southern part of China is characterized by these very dramatic limestone mountains. This is sort of, I grew up going with my parents off into the Art Institute of Chicago, where they had beautiful Chinese landscape paintings. And until I was maybe 12 years old and actually saw a photograph of this landscape, I just assumed that was a style in which the Chinese painted mountains. I never imagined that there were landscapes that looked like that. But they do here, and they look like that because this is an area that accumulated carbonate limestone sediments for hundreds of millions of years, and has a very, very good fossil record. And in the very moist and warm climate of that part of the world right now, these limestone platforms are eroding chemically into these big sorts of spires, what we call a karstic landscape. But we go there and we can get really good records through this interval. And so again, and this is not my own work, right? So this is work that has been done by many paleontologists, Chinese and Western, over the past several decades. Can go out to, and there's one region in particular that is exceptionally well studied because interbedded throughout these limestones are also volcanic ashes, and volcanic ashes are really nice because they have radioactive isotopes that allow us to date them quite precisely. So we're able to get a much more finely tuned chronology in this part of the world than we can in some other places. And so as before, if we plot up, every one of these vertical lines represents the stratigraphic range of a species from its first appearance to its last appearance. And as is always the case, right, there are always species coming and going. So there's always some background extinction. There's arguably maybe a little bit of a pulse of extinction down here. But the main extinction pulse we can see is right at this level. And at the same time, right, if we're also looking at our geochemical stable isotope proxies, notice right here the carbon isotope record is kind of wiggling around with some interesting structure, but by and large, not much going on through most of the late Permian. And then right at this same level, there's a big sharp drop. And as I mentioned before, the fact that there are volcanic ashes sort of intercalated throughout this sequence allows us to constrain the timing of this extinction event and the associated shift in carbon isotopes to within about less than 60,000 years, potentially much less, but that's just not resolvable right now. And we don't just see this in South China. Go to other parts of the world that have good records through this interval, and they all show a similar story. A shift in carbon isotope ratios by about 3 to 5 parts per thousand, which it doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a big shift. We think of it in terms of mass balance. And this indicates, the only way to explain this is with the release of a very large pool of isotopically light carbon into the atmosphere. And some of that comes actually from volcanic activity itself, but not enough. So when this event was first recognized and when the carbon isotope shift was first recognized, people really had a hard time trying to come up with a model that could shift this much. It turns out, even if you go through the exercise of, I think I mentioned before that photosynthetically fixed carbon is isotopically light compared to carbon that has not been photosynthetically fixed. That's the major lever that moves this ratio. So, and of course, because I myself am not photosynthetic, but I eat things that are, so I have that same carbon isotopic composition. All life has a different carbon isotopic composition than non-life on Earth. If you go through the exercise of just saying you kill literally all biomass at the Earth's surface and oxidize it, put it into the atmosphere, that's still not enough to move the dial enough. So this was a real puzzle for a long time. Another striking piece of evidence about what's going on is that if we turn to our oxygen isotope record, right, which remember gives us insight into temperature and climate, we see an absolutely whopping shift. So the way to interpret this here, so again, time is on the y-axis. This is a different site, again, in South China. And every one of these points down here, so the extinction event is at this red line. So this is the oxygen isotopic composition on the x-axis. At the base, don't really pay attention to that, but that's translated into a temperature estimate up here. So you can see that kind of prior to this event, this is an environment that experienced water temperatures that are pretty typical of sort of subtropical to tropical regions on the Earth today, in sort of the low to mid 20s centigrade. Above this line, and again, in tandem with this oxygen, where the carbon isotope shift, you're reconstructing temperatures that are like 34, 35 degrees Celsius. This is hotter than it gets anywhere in the Earth's surface waters today. And they are close to temperatures at which enzymes begin to denature. Life starts to get very, very difficult in the oceans. For reference, in centigrade, human body temperature is about 37 degrees. Right. And there are places at which following this event, at which we might actually be attaining this. There's a big, big warming event amounting to, on average, maybe something like 10 degrees Celsius. And many of you are probably aware, right? We are very deeply concerned right now about whether we're going to be able to hold current warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees is going to have an impact. 10 degrees is an absolute disaster. So what's the cause? I've already hinted at this, but another thing that we've known for a long time about the late Permian world is that up here in what was then and it remains now high northern latitudes in Siberia are massive, massive lava flows that cover a larger area than any other known event like this in Earth history. So these are what are called the Siberian traps. And it's been known for a long time that these roughly coincide with the extinction event. But again, through tools, many of them again developed here at Berkeley, that allow us to more precisely date these flows, our picture has come into sharper and sharper focus, and it's become very clear that these not just coincide with the event, but are almost certainly the fundamental cause of the extinction event. And one of the reasons that this particular eruption is probably so damaging in the end relative to, there aren't any other volcanic eruptions that are quite this big, but there are some that are, half as big, but they don't cause half the extinction or even close. A big part of it probably has to do with what we call target effects, which is what are the rocks that are actually being affected by this volcanic eruption. And here's where this event starts to actually become kind of attention-getting from the present day point of view. First, actually, let me just take a step back and explain why there are such massive volcanic eruptions occurring here in the first place. So this is not a normal eruption. This is not the kind of eruption that goes on, all over the Earth on an annual basis. And it's not even the kind of eruption that you may have read about as potentially causing catastrophes within human history. Something like a Toba eruption, or going further back, a Yellowstone eruption. Those are all tiny compared to this kind of eruption. This is what's called a flood basalt eruption. And these things occur when big plumes of warm mantle rock rise up, and particularly when they hit a continental landmass, which is a relatively good insulator. Eventually, they start to work their way through those rocks. Some of that molten material makes it to the surface and erupts out and forms, again, the gigantic lava flows that we see at this time. But most of it actually doesn't make it to the surface. Most of it instead is injected into the rock that it rises up through. And it's injected in the form of, for those of you who've had a little bit of geology, what we call sills and dikes. These are just kind of tabular bodies of magma that are essentially fracked. You can think of them as very much like fracking, that are injected at high pressure into the rocks and then essentially cook them, right, as you would imagine. And the issue here is that this part of Siberia is an area where, again, marine and terrestrial sediments had been accumulating for a long time beforehand. And in particular, in the terrestrial sediments, there's lots and lots of coal. So this is an area, this is just following on the period of geological time we call the Carboniferous, and we call it the Carboniferous because it's when the great majority of Earth's coal was formed and put into the geological record. And so essentially what you're doing here with these eruptions is heating and oxidizing a huge amount of coal. And of course, that's something that we have a little bit more experience of recently. So even though the fundamental driver is very, very different, some of the follow-on effects from this eruption are actually quite similar to the issues that we're dealing with today. And you can actually see this in places, right? So this is a body of basaltic, well, formerly magma, it's cooled now, right? But basaltic volcanic rock that is in contact with coal. And you see this white layer. This is all sort of ash that has been left over from the in-place oxidation of coal. And turns out there's a lot of other stuff in this sequence of sedimentary rocks that's also not great to oxidize and pump into the atmosphere. There's a lot of limestone also. And again, some of you probably know that cooking limestone to produce concrete is another major source of CO2 emissions today. There's a lot of organic rich sediments that are full of stuff that, again, go, volatiles that go into the atmosphere. There's quite a bit of salt, which actually turns out to potentially be bad for the Earth's ozone layer. And that's a part of the terrestrial story I won't go into here, but it's an interesting emerging line of evidence. But the main thing, right, is you pump very, very quickly a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and a lot of other associated gases. And then you initiate a whole sequence of potential downstream effects, right? So again, we have evidence of rapid and extreme warming. And that is associated always, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, with deoxygenation of the oceans. Of course, CO2 goes into the atmosphere, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere. A lot of it goes into the oceans as carbonic acid and drives them to lower pH, right? So that's another thing we are increasingly concerned about right now. So you have the potential for quite extreme ocean acidification. You also have sulfur dioxide associated with, again, this sort of cooking of all of these organics and coal that will go into the atmosphere and cause more locally acid rain, bad for terrestrial ecosystems. I mentioned already the potential effects of production of halogens going into the upper atmosphere and destroying the ozone layer. And then, of course, you have this issue that once you start to stress ecosystems and cause extinctions, particularly of primary producers, you quickly start to get a lot of secondary extinctions, right? You get accelerating ecosystem collapse, where the more extinction occurs, the more secondary extinctions there are. So this actually, again, shows up in South China in places as a very distinct surface. And the reason we can actually see it here. So this is my colleague Jonathan Payne's photo here, but we can actually draw a line right here and say below this, these are limestones that are full of the fossils of sort of healthy late Permian marine organisms living their happy Permian lives. And above this, they're almost entirely gone. The only things that we find in here are occasional snails, and snails even now are very, very good at hacking it in places where other marine organisms have a hard time. And quite a lot of what are called microbialites. So microbialites, these are sedimentary rocks that are made by microbial activity, right? So as animal and metazoan ecosystems really start to suffer and collapse, microbial communities really surge in production. And the reason why this surface it's sharp, but also notice how uneven it is. And this is, we think, evidence of submarine dissolution due to ocean acidification. That again, these are limestones. If pH begins to drop, they will actually dissolve. And we see this associated with a number of other events also, right? So this is direct evidence potentially for ocean acidification. And then there are more recently some interesting lines of geochemical evidence that are pointing in that same direction. So if you kind of look at the fossils that are in there and try and reconstruct what those ecosystems look like, again, it's pretty bleak. You go from a late Permian reefs that, again, the players are very different from the modern, but they look in terms of their structure and function in many ways like modern reef systems, to a world with, mostly these are kind of algal buildups, what we call stromatolites, with, some animals that are able to hack it, some that even are able to thrive under these conditions, but many fewer. And this goes on for the recovery from this event is not rapid. It takes millions of years, 4 to 5, 6 million years before you start to see ecosystems come back that obviously have very different species, but that start to have some of the same structure and function. So we had this question before about what kinds of animals are particularly strongly influenced or affected. And in this case, one of the really interesting selective patterns associated with this event is you might, if you think that ocean acidification, changes in pH are one of the drivers of extinction, then you might hypothesize that the kinds of organisms that are going to have the hardest times are the ones that are really dependent on precipitating a heavy calcium carbonate skeleton, right? Because that gets much more difficult, much more costly as ocean pH goes down and the saturation state of the oceans changes. And so if we take all of the animals that existed in the oceans in that time and sort of divide them up into 3 groups, the heavily calcifying, intermediate, and lightly or not calcifying groups, there's a pretty striking pattern that emerges. Heavily calcifying groups, and this includes a lot of our brachiopods and corals, some big calcifying sponge groups that were the major reef builders of the time. They experience extremely high rates of extinction. This intermediate grouping, still, by any other standard, quite high, but much reduced rates of extinction, proportion of extinction. And the uncalcifying group, you wouldn't say that they, skate through unscathed, but they, relatively speaking, take much lower losses than these other groups. So that's a pattern that at least strongly suggests that changes in pH and saturation state are one part of what's going on. But there's another issue that we're increasingly focusing on as a potential major part of this event, which is that rising temperatures really tighten a metabolic constraint for animals living in the oceans. And so a lot of you probably know, if you've ever had to take any physiology in a biology class, you know that for metabolic rates of organisms are strongly influenced by ambient temperature. And that's just sort of a function of thermodynamics. At higher temperature, reaction rates go faster. And so this is data from a bunch of modern marine species. So every color represents a different species. And don't worry too much about this very complicated sort of axis label, but this is basically a measure of oxygen consumption, metabolic rate. And what you can see is that there's a lot of variation, but all of these species exhibit increased metabolic rate at higher temperatures, meaning they need more oxygen to do the same amount of metabolic work. The problem is that also, as many of you probably know from chemistry class, the solubility of oxygen in water is inversely dependent on temperature. Warmer water holds less oxygen. So you have this real problem if you're dealing with something like a 10 degrees Celsius temperature increase, that metabolic rates, even the organisms that are able to survive 10-degree warmer waters or disperse to areas that have temperature ranges, in the ranges that they were used to, right? Maybe move from equatorial habitats up towards the poles, are still going to face a significant issue with, sort of running into this metabolic wall where you're running out of oxygen, you have higher metabolic rates. And that you can make a prediction from that as well, which is that the species that are most likely to be most strongly impacted by that particular extinction mechanism are at higher latitudes. And so you can take an Earth system model, and this is work done by some of my colleagues, and try and model if we were to warm the world by 10 degrees, and you can model a late Permian world, what's the extinction rate we would expect as a function of latitude, going from, again, high southern latitude through the equator into high northern latitude. And you see, the lines here represent the pattern that you see at different depths there. The red points here are the actual empirical pattern that we observe in the fossil record. So it matches it fairly closely, right? We do see higher extinction rates at higher latitudes. So the suggestion here is that both changes in pH and higher metabolic demand combined with reduced oxygen availability are major agents of extinction in this event. Okay, so finally, right, in the title, I said something about the future. So is any of this important to thinking about the future? Well, I've already dropped a lot of hints as to why I think it is. And the reason, of course, is for very, very different reasons. We are undertaking a similar experiment to what happened in the Permian, and it also turns out in a couple of other subsequent mass extinction events, the Triassic-Jurassic event I mentioned already. So when we see major perturbations of the carbon cycle in the geological record, there's a little bit of a threshold where that, again, the event duration is a difficult thing to nail down. That's something that we're still work on a lot, trying to actually better constrain the timescales of changes here. But one of the things that you can see is that there appears to be like a little bit of a threshold here where if you get a large enough carbon isotope curve in a short enough period, or large enough carbon isotope excursion in your record over a short enough period of time, you tend to get mass extinction events, right? So with the late Devonian event, which is indicated here by FF, again, it's kind of a weirdo outlier here that we don't understand very well. But generally, right, large and rapid perturbations of the carbon cycle recorded in the carbon isotope record tend to coincide with major mass extinction events. You can, based on that, actually try and estimate a threshold. And, I think it is an interesting exercise. I wouldn't take this too seriously. There's a lot of uncertainty here, but there is at least a hint that we are kind of about halfway to reaching that threshold in terms of the amount of carbon that we have put into the atmosphere over a short period of time. And this estimate is actually a bit out of date. This number is considerably higher now. And we're already starting to see the effects of that play out in the oceans. So we can actually track this pulse of isotopically light carbon from oxidizing fossil fuels going into the oceans, and we track it. We see it in the same way that we see it in the late Permian and in the late Ordovician. So if we look at the isotopic composition of organisms that are growing skeletons from the oceans, in this case, this is a cross section through a coral, right? We can date these things very well. We know they grow in annual layers. And so some of them grow for hundreds of years. So every one of these colored lines represents a different coral or sponge record. And we can see that they are all trending towards lighter carbon isotope values as this big slug of photosynthetically fixed carbon from coal and oil goes into the atmosphere and then into the oceans. And of course, at the same time, as most of you are probably familiar, that is leading to increased carbonic acid in surface waters. And surface waters then are going into the deeper ocean, and ocean pH is starting to drop. We get to the point now, this is where it varies a lot depending on the projections we make about where we're gonna, where we're headed. And the good news is, I think that some of the worst case scenarios that have been used to make some of these projections are probably not likely anymore, right? We actually are starting to move the needle in some ways on at least future emission scenarios. But under a business as usual model, things get dire pretty quickly. So by the end of the century, you're dealing with pH ranges that are probably not sustainable for the great majority, at least, of reef building corals and even for some other calcifying organisms. And you can see this, right? If you take carbonate producing organisms today and you rear them in water with the predicted pH and chemical composition of, say, 2100. So these are, believe it or not, actually snails. These are pteropods that are planktonic. They are one of the more obscure groups out in the oceans, but they're actually tremendously important. They're, among other things, their major food source for salmon when they are out in the ocean. So the salmon, some of you probably know that California has just closed salmon fisheries in Northern California for the next 2 years because the returning salmon run is very low. And they are dependent in part on what's happening out in the oceans, and they depend actually a lot on these pteropods for food. And if you raise pteropods in projected 2100 water, they have a pretty hard time calcifying, and it's probably not good news for them and probably not good news for salmon. Of course, we're also very aware, the coral reefs are going to suffer from pH. They're not there yet in most places, but they're already being strongly impacted by marine heat waves, hypoxia, right? So these are things we've encountered before in association with major mass extinction events. And then, of course, there are some other things in the mix that haven't been there for previous mass extinction events, right? So there is also coastal pollution, which is a major driver of coral reef declines in many areas. Overfishing is another stressor, right? And so even before we're starting to see the pH impacts, we are now seeing repeated marine heat waves coming with an intensity and frequency that is unprecedented, at least within documented human history, right? And we've seen some very severe bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef, for example, in the past decade. And unfortunately, we are probably heading for another one in the next year because we are heading into what looks to be shaping up to be potentially a quite strong El Nino event, which is going to mean very warm surface temperatures. And then, as I mentioned, right, there are other things in the mix that are for which we don't have good precedent in the fossil record, right? So overfishing is a huge issue for marine ecosystems. And this is one of my favorite examples to show right here. This is an example of what we call sliding baselines, which sort of we often don't even notice this happening. These are 3 different shots that a colleague of mine put together for a publication showing the size of trophy fish on the same pier in Key West in 1957, in 1982, and in 2007. And so, the lesson take away from this, right, is that a lot of, your grandfather's stories are true. Fish really did used to be a lot bigger in a lot of places, right? And what now passes for a trophy fish is something that almost certainly would have been thrown back immediately in the 1950s. So this is a table that some colleagues and I put together for a publication several years ago, where we can compare the big 5 extinction events here are in bold, and then there's a whole litany of interesting other events. But the main thing to take away here, right, is again, we have several mechanisms that are in play from previous events, and then we have a few other things going on that are probably exacerbating the situation. I'm going to wrap up here because I know I've gone on for a bit. So even if we just focus on warming and deoxygenation, worst case emission scenarios that I'm happy to say are probably not realistic right now. We're almost certainly not going to do that. But, if we were to take, say, RCP 8.5, which is the IUCN kind of worst case business as usual scenario, and get up to something like a late Permian temperature change, we would predict that we would, within a couple of 100 years, experience extinction magnitudes that are comparable to some of these major events in the geological record. That I think I will I have some other slides, but I think I'll end that right here. And so, the big question now, driving a lot of my own work, but many other people in the field, is to try and unpack the nuances of some of these events and understand how they differ from one another, because not every one of these events where you put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere really quickly is associated with a major mass extinction. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And so I think it's still I think we're almost certainly headed for some kind of discernible marine extinction event. So if a paleontologist 20 million years from now goes out and starts looking at the record of the present, I think, there will certainly be, and already are, some significant marine extinctions associated with the present. But whether that is an event that will rank with the big five is still very much an open question. And although I know the conclusion of this talk is a little bit bleak, I'm actually increasingly optimistic that that's not very likely. But there's still a lot of big questions that need to be answered before we can feel confident in that. All right, so sorry for that, went on a bit longer than I intended. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Audrey has a question.
Yep. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Seth, for this amazing talk and so much information. What can we as individuals do to head off these extinctions?
That's a great question. And I know from my parents, actually, that a lot of people involved in Ashby Village are already doing, I think, the right things. Certainly, we absolutely need to cut emissions, and we need to cut them quickly. And, the good news is technologically that's becoming more and more feasible, but it remains a big political problem, right? So lobbying local politicians, I know some people from Ashby Village have been involved in pushing to the UC to divest from oil companies, which they did do a few years ago. I think an equal, or in some ways bigger problem, I think is overfishing. So I think there is a recently ratified treaty that will put in place some infrastructure for trying to enforce conservation laws on the open seas. Part of the problem, right, is that right now different nations have jurisdiction over the coastal waters, but the open oceans are kind of, a free-for-all, and that's terrible news. And so I think pushing to, for a unified global legal and conservation framework, particularly on fisheries, is a huge thing.
Roger?
I'll do it. Thanks.
Okay, well, I had a bit more of a personal question. What's it like to be up in the northern Canada in the summertime? Do you have to worry about bears?
Oh, that's a great question. Fortunately, on Anacostia Island, there actually aren't bears. And it could use them, because what Anacostia Island has in insanely high abundance is deer.
Oh.
So the biggest threat actually is driving around and not hitting deer, which is very hard to do. I've been fortunate to never hit one, but and the deer population, as I said, the population of the island is actually very small. So everyone on the island eats tons of venison, and I'm normally a vegetarian, but when I go there, I eat tons of venison, but it's not enough. And weirdly, actually, it is kind of it's a high-end hunting destination for wealthy Americans, which means that when the American economy tanks, there aren't enough wealthy hunters to go up and shoot deer on Anacostia, and the population of the deer explodes. But other than that, it's very pleasant. The other thing that is related to the deer and an issue is that in the early part of the summer, the first couple of times I went, I was an idiot and didn't pay enough attention to advice from people who had worked there before. And I got there at the beginning of mosquito and black fly season, and it was miserable in a way that it was bug stress of an order of magnitude greater than anything I've ever experienced. I've learned that if you go starting in kind of mid-July, it's much more pleasant. So by and large, it's quite nice if you are not an idiot and actually listen to what people are trying to tell you.
Okay, thank you.
Sarah?
Hi, Seth. I really enjoyed your talk. I found it really interesting that you keep a cheerful demeanor while rattling off a lot of big words, some of which I wrote down to look up later. My question is, what is the class you're going to take at Santa Cruz?
Oh, yeah. So I'm the class I'm teaching right now is called Paleontological Perspectives on Ecology and Evolution. And it's sort of the goal is, because although I'm really a geologist mostly by training, in a biology department, and the goal of the class is sort of to tell mostly junior and senior biology students what are the things that the fossil record tells us that any biologist should know. So it's sort of different lessons from the fossil record, but most of the class is lecture and labs, and I really want them to have a chance to actually look at fossils in the field. And the best place that locally to do that is along the coast in San Mateo County and Santa Cruz. And particularly where I take them is Capitola Beach, as I mentioned before, which has is a very pleasant spot. It's very easy to get to, although I am a little concerned because, as some of you know, it got pretty badly hammered this past winter. But yeah, it's really just to take them out so that they have some experience of not just looking at specimens in drawers, but actually, you can find whale bones all over the place there. It's a great place for students.
Great recommendation. We love that area too. So that gives us one more reason to go visit there. So the main thing I was curious about was, so interesting to know that geology is your thing as well. It sounds like it's a very pan academic course to lead to the specialty you are in now. That you're taking geology and geography and all these different things to get to the bottom of the ocean.
Well, right. Yeah, that's it.
And everything that's happened along the coast. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is, these are, we're talking about events that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. So to have any hope of understanding them, you really need to draw together every little bit of evidence from every possible field that you can. And on my more cynical days, I would say that it's, like we're still arguing over, who killed Kennedy, and there's film of that, right? So some of these things are sort of fundamentally, we will never know for sure, but we can narrow down our zone of ignorance. But yeah, to do that a lot, it's often hard fought, and you have to kind of try to get blood from the stone wherever you can, sometimes literally.
Thank you. That's great.
Joan has a question. Unmute yourself, Joan.
Yes, I was intrigued by one little snippet of your talk where you said, I was intrigued by the whole thing, but I'm asking about one little snippet where you seem to be showing us an ancestor of whales that was quite teeny. Can you give us a little sketch of how that little thing became a whale?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I can, but it's unfortunately it's not as interesting as you might hope. It's just very young. It's you know, it is probably a newborn.
Oh, I see. So it really is going to grow up into a whale type thing.
Yeah, although, you know, probably not a blue whale. It's you know, it is a balanopterid, a baleen whale. So it's not a porpoise, but one of the smaller ones, you know, probably something kind of maybe minky size, still quite big. But yeah, that's a quite young one.
Okay, thank you.
We do find
Okay.
bigger ones there as well, I should say. And you can too. These are things that are sitting right out on the beach. And if anyone wants to go, I'm happy to send you coordinates. The issue is it changes all the time. Sorry.
I noticed that you do all of your deep sea diving on dry land. You don't actually go into the ocean, do you?
I don't for the work that I presented here, not for the working on the Late Ordovician. I do some modern marine ecology or work on the much younger fossil record. I do that mostly in Panama, and I also teach a field course that is in French Polynesia. The UC Berkeley has a field station on the island of Moorea. And
So you
I do a lot
you
of,
don't stay dry.
no, I love, you know, I came very close to just, you know, going to graduate school for marine biology, but I do like the deep time component, but I'm a recreational diver for the most part.
Yeah, Sharon has a question.
I do. Hi, Seth. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I have two questions. They're connected. My partner Ben's brother is a coastal geologist in the state of Hawaii, also a professor for the University of Hawaii.
Oh,
Many things that and he was sorry he couldn't attend this, but he's 3 hours behind and had a meeting. And so I wonder a couple of things, because so much of what you said, I'm sure would resonate with him, and I could hear the geology in you. So I wondered if you could comment about the cross-pollination of study that's so integrative in so many ways that affect climate. Any thoughts you have for us about that? And it sounds like you're cross-teaching in various places, but I just wonder. And the second is, many of us hear all of these issues around global warming, and we're just so flooded. And of course, Congress doesn't pay any attention to anything. But what's helpful, and I wonder if you could think about maybe the top three, much of your talk discussed ways that connect what you've learned with something we could be doing. And if we would just think about ways to make that, turn that into English and prioritize what they might be, I wonder if we couldn't get more successful traction. So I just wondered your thoughts on those two things.
so those are both great and big questions. And so the first thing I'll say is, you know, again, I think I'm not a big, you know, I think the trend in academia is always sort of towards greater specialization, and that's, you know, there's a lot of insight you get that way, but you know, Darwin was a geologist and a biologist, right? And sort of the whole sort of foundations of my field and my department come from not, you know, from trying to look across disciplines. So I think that's tremendously important. And actually, you know, I should say also you may know if you've talked to my parents that my brother Noah is actually also a geomorphologist, not a coastal geomorphologist, but he teaches actually at UC Santa Cruz. And we've been lucky to collaborate a little bit on a few projects. And so I think that's very important and very productive, and more than anything else, also to me, just fun and interesting. With respect to your second question, Yeah, the translating into English part is the tricky bit, right? And I am a little bit, there is a growing field of paleontology in particular, sort of focused on trying to both study the recent fossil record as a way of kind of trying to understand changes that have happened just in the past few hundreds and thousands of years, but also the deeper time fossil record to extract lessons from that that are actually actionable, where you can go to policymakers and say, these are the recommendations that we have based on our understanding of the fossil record. And I think that that's still tough, but I think, there are more and more people focused on this. There was, for the first time in the last IPCC report, one of my colleagues, a paleontologist, and his group were involved in drafting that, and also involved in IUCN assessments. So sorry, I got that backwards. IPCC has had paleo people involved for a long time, IUCN. And I think we need to get better at not just doing our science and then going to policymakers or to stakeholders and saying, this is what we've learned, but at approaching it as a, what's called co-production process, where, we go to the people that are most impacted and say, what do you want to know? What's the kind of information that would be most helpful for you? And factor that in when we do our science in the first place, rather than doing what I've tended to do, and I think many of us tend to do, which is just to sort of follow our bliss and say, what's the question I'm most interested in? That's a nice, it's a privilege to be able to do that, but I think sometimes we need to take more time to make sure that what we do is going to result in information that is relevant and actionable.
Mhm.
I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It does, Seth. It sounds like this is a dilemma of a lot of basic scientists.
Very much. Yeah.
I'm an executive coach, and I coach a lot of basic scientists. So this completely resonates.
Yeah. And
Thank you very much for your insight.
Well, thank you. It's a great question. I wish I had a better answer, but I'm at least optimistic that there are more people thinking about it now.
Well, an amazing webinar, and just full of really interesting information. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all attending.
Do we have any more questions before I wrap this up? I want to point out a couple of things before I thank Seth profusely here. Edwin, you put out a comment about global mining. We had a speaker, Dr. Kim Juniper, who spoke about that, and you would find that presentation at the Ashby Village YouTube website. Yeah, entire presentation on that topic. If you find this interesting, again, and I remind you that we have 2 presentations coming up this summer on a similar topics, California, atmospheric rivers and how they affect California. And then we have someone else speaking to us on global climates. And those will be both this summer. And with that, I want to thank you, Seth. Bravo for a great job.
Well, thank you. And I also I don't want to go before also, I have to thank some other, not just my parents, but particularly John and Sally Halderman, who I see showed up, very old and dear friends who played a large role in raising me also, and our Edna DeVore as well. So thank you all for coming. And I saw Sam Engel earlier, but I think he's had to move on. Anyway, thank you very much. And I look forward to hopefully meeting some of you in person at some, now that that's becoming more of a possibility.
Thank you again. Bravo.